Okay, let's look at number 7. Which of the following would weaken the argument? Let's read the argument and figure out what's going to weaken it. So it says, in a recent study of elementary school computers, it turned out that all the keyboards and most of the monitors were positioned higher than what's recommended for children. And consequently, children were seated in ways that encouraged craned necks, awkwardly placed wrists, and other things that are sort of unhealthy postures. Evidently, most elementary school computers are installed without any consideration of their effect on posture, and thus, and here's the final conclusion, here's the final word, and thus, therefore, they put children at the same risk for repetitive stress injuries as they do office workers. So that's the conclusion, right? If you follow consequently, evidently, thus, that's the final word. Thus introduces the conclusion. Everything that came before that is brought as support for that. The final conclusion here is saying that children are at the same risk. These computers that are placed in these awkward ways are putting children at the same risk for repetitive stress injuries that office workers have. So anything that weakens that is going to be the answer. Anything that tells you no, children are not at the same risk. So we don't have to weaken all the above information, all the support brought. In other words, yeah, maybe they are placed awkwardly for children. Maybe that's all true. All we have to argue, all we have to weaken here is that even though all this might or might not be true, it doesn't put children at the same risk for repetitive stress injuries as office workers. So any answer that shows you that children are not at the same risk as office workers for repetitive stress injuries is going to be the right answer. So let's take a look for that. A is neither here nor there, because A tells us that the height that's recommended for computers is different for children than it is for adults. Okay, great. I mean, that's what we would expect. Adults are generally taller than children are, right? It doesn't change anything because the paragraph already told us that the keyboards and monitors were positioned higher than recommended for children. So whatever the recommendation is for children, we know that these computers are not following that recommendation. Now, what's the recommendation for adults? Probably different because adults are taller, right? But that doesn't change the fact that the computers are still not positioned in an optimal situation for children. So therefore, this doesn't weaken anything. B doesn't help us out here because B tells us that children spend more time on computers at home than at school. Okay, great. Maybe that's a good thing. We don't know how their computers at home are positioned, but it's neither here nor there because we're trying to argue that the children using the computers at school, we're trying to argue that that's putting them at risk. Now, B is saying, well, they're also using computers at home, and in fact, they use the computers at home a lot more. Okay, great, but that's neither here nor there because that's not what this argument's about. This argument is about the fact that they're using the computers at school, which they still are doing. We're saying that because those computers at school are placed in an awkward way, they are placing those children at risk. Now, B is saying they also spend a lot more time working with computers at home. Okay, fine. Maybe or maybe not, that is putting them at risk, or maybe it's not putting them at risk, but that doesn't matter, right? The point is that the computers at school are putting them at risk for these injuries, right? So B doesn't change that, and therefore it's not going to weaken the argument. C is going to directly weaken the conclusion, and therefore this is exactly the right answer. C says that the fact that their bodies are more supple makes them less susceptible than adults to repetitive stress injuries, which is exactly weakening the conclusion. Because what was the conclusion? The conclusion was saying that these computer placements are placing children at the same risk for repetitive stress injuries as office workers. But C says, no, it's not going to be the same risk for repetitive stress injuries because you know what? Because children's bodies are more supple. They're less susceptible than adults to repetitive stress injuries. So that means they're going to be less susceptible than office workers who are presumably adults to these repetitive stress injuries. It directly weakens the conclusion and therefore is the right answer. So we didn't change any of the information that was given in support of the conclusion because that wasn't what our job was, right? Yes, it is still perhaps true that computers are placed awkwardly for children and they're straining their necks and blah, 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 blah. Yes, maybe that's true. But C says, even though just because support doesn't mean conclusion, right? Just because all that's true doesn't mean they're just as susceptible as adults, meaning maybe they're still susceptible to injuries, but certainly not as susceptible to these repetitive stress injuries as adults because they are generally less susceptible to these things because their bodies are more supple. So that directly weakens the conclusion and therefore is correct. D is not going to help us out because it doesn't say anything about children. It talks to us about the adults. D says that the office workers' keyboards and monitors are also not at the recommended heights for them, right? The paragraph told us that the children's computers and monitors are not at a recommended height for them. And D says, yeah, that's also true about office workers, that office workers' keyboards and monitors are also not at the recommended height for them. So yeah, so according to D, they're both in trouble, right? The children and the adults are both doing things in a not so optimal way. That certainly doesn't weaken the argument, right? If anything, you could almost say that it strengthens the argument, because the whole argument is trying to say that the fact that the computers are placed this way for children puts them at the same risk that office workers are at. And D says, yeah, office workers also have computers placed at not the recommended heights for healthy postures for adults. So according to D, it kind of seems to strengthen the conclusion. It strengthens the argument because it says, yeah, according to D, they're both the same, right? They're both children and adults are using computers that are not placed optimally for them. So therefore, maybe the conclusion is true that they are at the same risk, right? So therefore, D certainly doesn't weaken the argument. E is certainly neither here nor there, because E is about reporting injuries. It's not about getting injuries, it's about reporting injuries. It says office workers are more likely to report injuries, which we would expect, right, than children. Who do children report injuries to? Office workers, we would expect, would probably be more likely to report those injuries, or maybe not. I don't know, maybe children are more likely to, talk about injuries. Either way, it doesn't really matter, right? The question is not who reports more injuries. The question is who is at more risk for injury. So whether this group reports more than that group or less than that group is totally irrelevant. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.